doctors don't do the proper checks.
Yes, that's right. But to be clear, she's saying that it varies from area to area and also from doctor to doctor. I've been told that some doctors do check as well, but they just send a general form for teachers to fill out, which is the same for ADHD or other behavioural disorders as it is for physical conditions like asthma.
Why is it so important to check what goes on at school?
The risk is that, number one, if they don't check, they don't see it in different contexts, it might not actually be ADHD. And, of course, as well, the risk is that some families who are very keen to get an ADHD diagnosis could use the fact they're not checking to play the system.
So, like filling their kids up with fizzy drinks, as one emailer suggested before the diagnosis test.
Exactly. Well, the head of one primary school I spoke to told me about a 10-year-old whose parents lied to a paediatrician to get his dosage of ADHD drugs increased. The parents mentioned to the doctor lots of incidences that had supposedly happened in the school, whereas in fact the child hadn't even been coming into school for 3 months.
Wow.
The paediatrician sent an email to the child's GP, but copied in the school by mistake.
Basically, we had got a letter from a paediatrician who had not seen the child before. And bearing in mind that we had had him for 3 years, but the doctor had never even bothered to ring our school to find out if any of this was true. So we did write a letter back and spoke to the paediatrician to explain that the child hadn't actually been in school for 12 weeks.
So the parents had basically been telling fibs to the paediatrician?
Yes, to get the medication higher. They wanted more medication, so had exaggerated his behaviour.
So why do you think the paediatrician had not checked?
I've no idea. Because we weren't even supposed to see this letter. It had gone to the child's GP. We had been copied in by mistake.
So, because of that happy accident, I suppose, that one case was at least able to be rechecked. Goodness knows how many other cases there are out there which schools are simply unaware of.
But this case does have a happy ending after all that. The school contacted the doctor, who re-examined the child and determined that he didn't have ADHD at all, but rather had extreme anxiety. The child's medication's now been stopped altogether.
OK, Muckle, we'll come back to you for some more responses later. We've also got a guest with us, Professor Chris Hollis from Nottingham University and Queen's Medical Centre, a practising child psychologist as well, and Dave TRAXSON, a senior educational psychologist from the West Midlands. Professor Hollis, I want to pick up on some of the points made by the teachers and the one that Dave TRAXSON made a little bit earlier. He claims that 80% of these tests, of these diagnoses, are not made in accordance with the guidelines which you, as a member of NICE, drew up.
Well, that's very concerning, and I would agree entirely with Dave that this is if this is the data he's getting from the West Midlands, it is very concerning because, as I said, what we know is that if clinicians follow the guidelines, then diagnosis is accurate, and it is essential that it should involve teachers and they're part of that process. But clearly there is variation, and that's concerning. And often the issue is the implementation of guidance.
Well, quite. And is there anything in the system, once you've set your guidelines, to ensure that they are properly followed?
Well, I think there are a number of processes. There are audits and governance procedures within trust. There is also the new government's outcome framework, and they're the slight concerns, I think. Certainly I have concerns that what they're setting forward are care standards for various conditions, up to 150 conditions, and at the moment ADHD isn't one of those conditions. So I think there's a real onus, if we're going to take this seriously and implement guidelines to improve care for children and families, then we do need to ensure that government and that commissioning authorities, etc., are checking that these guidelines are being followed.
Yeah, pretty urgently by the sound of it, on the evidence I think we've got tonight. Let's get a word again with Dave TRAXSON. And Dave, I got this email from Stephen in Nottingham. He says, I have a child with ADHD. I've encountered a severe lack of knowledge in both the medical and educational professions about the condition. Educators, more often than not, think of it as bad parent syndrome, largely because they are so poorly educated about special educational needs during teacher training. Anything to that?
I mean, I don't want to get into blaming parents, as I said earlier. I'd rather pursue Chris's candour, really, about his concern. And I respect the work that Chris did on producing the NICE guidelines, but just to add alarm to what we've already got, I'd like to share the 3 most common breaches of the NICE guideline that happen in the West Midlands. And we're not talking about 10 cases, we're talking about hundreds of cases. The first is that it's given to children under the age of 6. And let's just remember, these are amphetamines, street name speed.
Well, they're not strictly amphetamines, are they?
No, they
do
are.
bear a chemical resemblance to amphetamine.
No, they are amphetamines. They are amphetamines.
Well, we'll get Professor Hollis to come back on that in a moment.
If I can just repeat the other 2 breaches, which I think Chris Hollis would be concerned about.
Yeah.
That they regularly do not monitor the weight of the children at 6 monthly intervals. And when a group of psychiatrists were asked about that, they said, we haven't got the manpower to do it. And one of their colleagues sort of implied, well, if they haven't got the manpower to do it, we perhaps shouldn't be giving so many prescriptions. And then the final breach, which I think is very concerning, is the regularity with which amphetamines, which are stimulants, that's the word that doctors prefer to use, because it's a bit quieter, are given to children with anxiety conditions. And we all know that when we're anxious personally, the last thing that you would have is a stimulant.
OK, well, Professor Hollis, firstly, is this amphetamine, and do you accept that children under the age of 6 are being improperly prescribed these drugs for ADHD?
Well, we were very clear in the guidelines that these drugs, the stimulants, the central nervous system stimulants, that includes methylphenidate, as you said, commonly known as Ritalin, dexamphetamine, should not be used for children under the age of 6 because there's no evidence and that the risks outweigh the benefits. We're also clear that they shouldn't be used as a first-line treatment in more moderate ADHD, and that's where behavioural support and psychological intervention should be used as a primary treatment.
I mean, having heard what you've heard tonight and the evidence brought forward on the show by Dave TRAXSON, are you willing, as a member of NICE, as somebody who issued the guidelines, to instigate any kind of review or investigation into this situation?
Well, I think it's an important issue that all commissioning PCTs and the trusts that doctors work should be reviewing how guidelines are being implemented. But I would say that the key message, though, is that we mustn't, and I agree with Dave again, not stigmatise the vast majority of parents who and young people who have really severe difficulties and impairment, and
well,
are actually struggling.
I think, in fairness, Professor Hollis, we have reflected that in the programme. We're talking about the cases where there is misdiagnosis and misprescription. We're getting texts and emails from paediatricians who are telling us that this is a real problem. What is going to be done about it?
Well, I think there's a range of issues, and I'm in a sense saying as well to the, I mentioned the government's outcome framework. If we're going to be serious about improving outcomes in healthcare and reducing variations, then conditions which have been somewhat at the margins, like ADHD, have to be taken seriously in terms of resourcing and in terms of commissioning. Because if this was happening to diabetes or heart disease, there would be an absolute uproar.
OK, Professor Hollis, thank you so much for your contribution tonight. Also to Dave TRAXSON, you are listening to 5 Live Investigates. Still to come, Virgin on the ridiculous. The rail travellers being asked to pay £6,000 for travelling from Coventry to London, and the Mubarak millions stashed in Britain.
5 Live Investigates.
First, your reaction to our story about the overprescription or misprescription of drugs like Ritalin for children diagnosed with ADHD. And Muckle, you've got plenty of responses there.
Loads of responses. I've got an email from Cheshire, no name on this. We know of parents who give their children energy drinks before doctor or hospital appointments to make them believe the child has ADHD. So
we've had more than one saying that, haven't we? Yeah.
People pumping their children full of sugar.
Amazing.
Richard in Northampton says, my son was eventually diagnosed with ADHD after referral by a GP to a specialist, and the whole process took a year before he was prescribed Ritalin. This enabled him to live a normal life, to make friends for the first time, to achieve good GCSEs. The real story, according to Richard, is the large number of undiagnosed cases, which often leads to children being suspended or expelled from school with consequent effects on the rest of their lives. So a reminder that the drugs do work for many.
Absolutely. And also, Richard, they're echoing the point made by Professor Chris Hollis, that as well as some children being diagnosed with ADHD when they don't have the condition, there may be many many other children out there who do have it who aren't being
Right,
diagnosed. Tony in Yorkshire says, before I retired as a GP a year ago, I did disability living allowance medicals, which included quite a few unreported ADHD children. The parents would give a classical history of ADHD with the child there. Most of the time, the child would just sit quietly through the interview, showing no signs at all of hyperactivity. Now, every week on 5 Live Investigates, we say we're here to